The survival of a medieval girl. Imagine this. You open your eyes to the cold stone walls of a drafty room. The year is 1325. You are not a princess, not a noble, not someone history will remember. You are a girl, a daughter in a world where daughters are seldom celebrated. Before you can even speak properly, your life has already been decided. Your parents hope you will survive infancy. Many girls do not. If you live, your future is one of work, obedience, and silence. The moment you are old enough to carry water, you will. The moment you are old enough to be married off, you will. This is not a fairy tale. This is survival. For a girl in the medieval era, danger lurks everywhere. Disease, poverty, hunger, childbirth, and war. Any one of them could claim her life before she reaches adulthood. But even if she lives, she is not truly free. Her body, her labor, even her marriage, all of it belongs to someone else. Her father, her husband, or the church. But there is more to this story than tragedy. There is also resilience. Some girls, though bound by custom and expectation, learned to survive, to adapt, and, in rare cases, even to rule. Their voices were quiet, often silenced, yet their struggles echo across the centuries. In this journey, we will step back in time and walk through the life of a medieval girl, from the moment of her birth, through childhood, marriage, and motherhood, to the rare glimpses of power some women seized against all odds. This is not just history, it is a story of survival against impossible odds. And as you listen, I want you to imagine, would you have survived? Would you have endured what they endured? But before we dive deeper into this world of shadows and survival, take a second to support this channel. Hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you more journeys into the forgotten corners of history. And don't forget to share this video with anyone you think would be captivated by the untold story of women in the medieval era.
Now, let us begin. Close your eyes. Step into the past. Hear the sound of iron church bells echoing across a muddy village square. Smell the smoke from peat fires clinging to your clothes. Feel the weight of expectation pressing down before you are even old enough to understand it. This is a girl's life in the medieval era, and it is harsher, darker, and more haunting than you ever imagined. Childhood and upbringing. The life of a medieval girl began with uncertainty. Even before she drew her first breath, her worth was judged. To many families, especially peasants, the birth of a girl was considered less fortunate than that of a boy. Sons promised strength in the fields, heirs for property, and a continuation of the family name. Daughters, though vital to survival, were often seen as burdens, destined to be married off with a dowry that might bankrupt the family. When a baby girl entered the world, her chances of survival were slim. Infant mortality was brutally high. 1 in 3 children never made it past their first year, and diseases spread swiftly in homes that lacked hygiene, warmth, or clean water. Mothers prayed feverishly, calling on saints to spare their daughters from fevers, infections, or the dangers of childbirth itself. Many mothers died bringing life into the world, and the cycle of fragility began anew. But let's imagine a girl survives. She grows from fragile infant to a toddler. What kind of childhood does she have?
For most peasant girls, play was a fleeting luxury. Her toys might be nothing more than a carved wooden doll, a ball of rags, or a set of pebbles. By the age of 5 or 6, she was already expected to help. She might gather eggs from the family's chickens, carry firewood, sweep dirt floors, or fetch water from the village well, sometimes walking long distances with a heavy bucket balanced awkwardly against her body. Childhood, as we understand it today, hardly existed. She was not protected from work or responsibility. Instead, she was trained early in the duties that would dominate her adult life. Meals were sparse and simple. Black bread made from rye, thin vegetable pottage, perhaps some cheese or fish if the family was lucky. Rarely, meat would appear on the table, but for most peasant children, hunger was a constant shadow. Malnutrition stunted growth, left immune systems weak, and made survival even harder. And yet, laughter still existed. Children ran barefoot in muddy lanes, played games of tag, sang rhymes, and chased one another through fields. Life was hard, but not without moments of joy. These fleeting sparks of happiness remind us that even in the darkest centuries, humanity found ways to shine. For noble girls, childhood looked very different, at least on the surface. Born into castles or manor houses, they were wrapped in fine linens, swaddled against the chill of stone halls, and nursed by wet nurses if their mothers were of high rank. Their survival chances were somewhat better thanks to wealth, but they were far from safe. Plague, fevers, and childbirth did not care for rank. Death claimed noble daughters as readily as peasant ones. By age 7, noble girls were often sent away to live in another household, beginning their training in manners, needlework, and courtly behavior. A childhood spent at her parents' side was a rarity. Instead, she was raised in the care of another family, partly as a form of political alliance, partly as preparation for the marriage that loomed in her future. If peasant girls were trained in survival, noble girls were trained in submission. They were taught to sew, to embroider, to read prayers in Latin if they were fortunate, and to carry themselves with grace. Their value was not in their labor, but in their lineage, in the alliances their marriages could bring. From the beginning, they were raised less as individuals and more as bargaining chips in the great game of dynasties.
Still, noble childhood was not without wonder. Castles echoed with music, feasts, and tournaments. Young girls watched knights tilt at one another in tournaments, listened to troubadours sing of love and valor, and grew up surrounded by the rituals of pageantry. But beneath the glittering surface lay the same truth as in the peasant village. Their lives were not their own. For every girl, noble or poor, obedience was drilled from the very start. A medieval child was expected to be quiet, respectful, and unquestioning of authority. Disobedience brought punishment, sometimes harsh. Parents, teachers, and clergy all reinforced the belief that children were miniature adults, born sinful, in need of correction and discipline. And so, from the first moments of life, a medieval girl was shaped not just by the hands that rocked her cradle, but by the expectations that pressed in from every side. She was not encouraged to dream of independence. Her future was not hers to choose. Instead, her upbringing was a slow preparation for the duties and restrictions that lay ahead. But remember, survival required adaptation. Some girls, though confined by duty, learned to carve out small freedoms. So a stolen moment to sing by the river, to whisper secrets with a sister, to hide a book of prayers under a straw mattress and teach herself letters by candlelight. These little acts of rebellion, quiet though they were, carried power. The childhood of a medieval girl was not just a season of innocence. It was her training ground. Training for service, for marriage, for survival. And every lesson, every chore, every rule prepared her for a world that would demand more of her than she could ever truly give.
Education, or lack of it. If you were a girl in the medieval era, the question of whether you received an education was not about intelligence or curiosity. It was about class, wealth, and gender. For most peasant girls, the idea of school simply did not exist. Your classroom was the smoky kitchen of your family's hut. Your lessons were not in books, but in bread-making, weaving, and tending to animals. By the age of 7, you already knew how to milk a cow, spin wool into yarn, knead dough for the morning's bread, and carry a jug of ale without spilling it. These skills were not just chores, they were survival. But what about letters, numbers, or writing your name? For the vast majority of girls, literacy was a distant dream. In fact, even most boys never learned to read. Only the sons of wealthy merchants, nobles, or clergy had access to tutors or cathedral schools. For girls, opportunities were even rarer. And yet, education for girls did exist, though limited and shaped by strict expectations. In villages, some priests would teach children their prayers, often in Latin. A few lucky girls might learn to recite the Lord's Prayer or memorize passages from the Psalms, even if they could not understand the words. But reading, let alone writing, was beyond the reach of almost every peasant daughter. For noble girls, the story was slightly different. Daughters of lords and kings might be given tutors, not to expand their minds freely, but to prepare them for their roles as wives, mothers, and ornaments of the court. They learned to read prayers, to write simple letters, and sometimes to study music or poetry. Latin, the language of the church, was usually reserved for boys, but in rare cases, noble girls mastered it too. A well-educated daughter could impress in courtly circles, but always within the narrow limits prescribed for her. Most noble girls, however, were not taught the philosophy of Aristotle or the science of Galen. Their education revolved around piety, obedience, and womanly skills. Needlework, embroidery, weaving, and managing a household were considered the true curriculum. A noble girl's textbook was often a piece of cloth stretched on a wooden frame, her writing, the stitches of golden thread forming patterns for church vestments or family banners.
But there was one path where education opened its doors to girls more freely, the convent. For families who could afford to send a daughter into religious life, a nunnery was both a spiritual refuge and an unexpected school. Within its walls, girls learned to read the Bible, to chant hymns, and sometimes even to write manuscripts. Convents became one of the few spaces in medieval Europe where women could pursue literacy. Some nuns became skilled scribes, copying holy texts in careful script, their hands steady as the hours passed in silence. Still, even this education was bound by limits. It was not meant to empower women beyond their roles, but to keep them firmly within the service of God and the Church. A girl could become literate, yes, but her knowledge was always framed as a tool of obedience, not independence. And yet, history leaves us tantalizing glimpses of girls who reached beyond what was permitted. In the 12th century, a German girl named Hildegard of Bingen entered a convent at the age of 8. There, she not only learned to read and write, but eventually grew into one of the most remarkable intellectuals of her age, a composer, philosopher, and visionary. But Hildegard was an exception, a rare flame in a world that preferred women to remain in the shadows. For the countless girls whose names we will never know, education was practical, not scholarly. They learned how to measure grain by eye, how to brew ale without poisoning their neighbors, how to keep accounts for a household, how to preserve food for winter. They became the silent experts of survival, their knowledge unwritten but vital. And perhaps the greatest lesson they absorbed was not from any tutor or priest, but from the world itself, obedience. The medieval girl was taught that her role was to listen, to serve, and to accept. To question authority, whether father, priest, or husband, was dangerous. Curiosity could be condemned as sin. Ambition could be labeled as pride. Education, then, was not about unlocking potential. It was about shaping girls into the molds their societies demanded. Knowledge was power, and in the medieval world, power was something rarely given to women.
Still, in the quiet corners of history, we find resistance. A girl who borrowed her brother's book by candlelight. A nun who copied not just psalms, but her own private reflections. A noblewoman who used her learning to advise her husband, or secretly, to influence the politics of her realm. Education was rare, but it could also be a weapon. And so, while most girls grew up with little chance to read or write, they learned a different kind of intelligence, resilience, adaptation, survival. Their classrooms were kitchens, fields, and convent halls. Their lessons were unrecorded, but they carried them for life. As we move forward in our journey, remember this: a girl's mind in the medieval world was not empty. It was hungry. Hungry for survival, hungry for knowledge, hungry for the freedom that education might one day bring, if only the world would allow it. Roles within family and community. From the moment a medieval girl could walk, she was not simply a child. She was a worker, a helper, a future wife, and a future mother. Her role was carefully prescribed by the expectations of her family and the unwritten rules of her community. In the medieval world, identity was not individual, it was collective. You were defined not by who you wanted to be, but by what you could contribute. Within the family, at the heart of a girl's life was the household. Whether that household was a humble peasant cottage with a thatched roof or a sprawling noble manor, her duties revolved around service. For peasant girls, this meant endless labor. The daily rhythm began with dawn. A girl might be sent to the well to fetch water before the sun had even risen. She would help tend the animals, sweep the dirt floors, and knead dough for the day's bread. By the time she was 8 or 9 years old, she could be trusted with looking after younger siblings, stirring pottage over the fire, or carrying bundles of firewood. Her work was not chores in the modern sense. It was the labor of survival. If she failed in her duties, the household itself might suffer.
Older girls were often put in charge of watching toddlers, rocking cradles while spinning wool on a drop spindle, their small hands learning to twist fibers into thread. In families that brewed ale, a common and necessary drink safer than water, daughters were involved in the brewing process, stirring vats and preparing grains. Alewives, as they were called, were often women, and daughters learned the trade from their mothers. In noble households, roles were different, but still bound by service. A girl's life was structured around refinement and obedience. She might spend mornings learning embroidery beside her mother or a governess, practicing stitches on fine cloth that would one day adorn an altar or a nobleman's cloak. She might oversee servants, learning how to manage a household, keep accounts, and ensure the kitchens were properly stocked. Her role was to observe, absorb, and prepare for the day she would manage her own estate as a wife. Community expectations. Beyond the family walls, the community also dictated a girl's place. Villages were tightly knit, and everyone's labor mattered. Girls fetched water not just for their own homes, but sometimes for neighbors. They helped gather herbs in the woods with older women, learning which plants healed and which harmed. They participated in harvests, gleaning leftover grains after the men and older boys had cut the fields. In these communal settings, girls also learned the unspoken rules of behavior. They were expected to be modest, obedient, and hardworking. A girl who was idle or outspoken might become the subject of gossip, a dangerous thing in a world where reputation was everything. Communities could be supportive, but they could also be harsh. A girl who stepped outside the expectations of her role could face suspicion, ridicule, or even accusations of sin or witchcraft. For noble girls, community meant courtly circles. Here, reputation was even more fragile. Every gesture, every word was scrutinized. A noble daughter was expected to embody grace and piety, to be an example of her family's prestige. She attended feasts, listened to troubadours, and observed the ceremonies of court, all while remaining quiet, obedient, and demure. She was never meant to outshine her brothers, but always to support the family's image.
Gender roles and obedience. Above all, a girl's role in family and community was one of obedience. Medieval society was hierarchical, and within the household, the father's word was law. Daughters were expected to obey fathers first, then husbands. Girls were reminded constantly of the biblical model. Eve had sinned, and so all women must be submissive to men. This idea was not a suggestion, it was drilled into the culture, preached from pulpits and reinforced in daily life. Obedience was not just about family honor, it was survival. A disobedient daughter might face punishment, but worse, she might lose her chance at marriage. And without marriage, a girl had little protection in a harsh world. Families relied on their daughters marrying well, or at least suitably, to secure alliances, maintain land, or simply ensure their child would be cared for. A life of service. Whether peasant or noble, the message was the same. A girl's role was to serve her family, her community, her future husband, and her God. Her duties were not framed as a choice, but as destiny. And yet, within this rigid framework, girls found ways to carve space for themselves. They sang while they worked, finding joy in small moments. They built friendships with other girls in the village, whispering secrets while they carried water. Noble girls sometimes formed bonds with the ladies in waiting in their households, creating networks of companionship that softened the loneliness of courtly life. There was no path to independence, not in the modern sense, but there were paths to survival and to resilience. Girls learned how to navigate expectations, when to stay silent and when to speak, when to obey and when to bend rules quietly. These unspoken skills were just as vital as spinning or sewing, and they carried them into adulthood. The weight of the future. Even as children, girls were aware that everything they did was preparing them for the roles ahead. Their mothers whispered lessons in quiet moments, how to please a husband, how to manage a household, how to endure childbirth. The future hung over them constantly, shaping their present. And so, in the medieval world, the role of a girl was never light. It was heavy with expectation, bound by obedience, and watched by family, neighbors, and God. But in every stitch, every bucket of water, every whispered secret, these girls carried within them the seeds of endurance.
Arranged marriages and political uses of noblewomen. In the medieval world, love was rarely part of marriage. For girls, marriage was not a matter of choice, but of strategy, duty, and survival. It was a transaction, an alliance, and sometimes a weapon in the great game of power. The age of marriage. For many girls, marriage came shockingly early. Among peasants, girls were often married in their mid-teens, sometimes as young as 14. In noble families, betrothals could be arranged when a girl was still a child.
Imagine being promised to a stranger before you even understood what marriage meant. By the time a noble girl was 12 or 13, she might already be a wife in name, her childhood cut short by duty. The church officially recommended that girls marry at 14 or older, but in practice many were betrothed earlier. For peasant girls, the timing depended on economic need. If a family needed to reduce the number of mouths to feed, a daughter could be sent off in marriage young, her dowry negotiated quickly. For noble girls, it depended on politics. A girl's marriage could seal alliances, secure peace treaties, or consolidate power between rival lords. Dowries and transactions. Marriage was not just about two people, it was about property. A girl's worth in marriage was often measured in dowry. This was the wealth, money, land, or goods that her family would provide to her husband's household. For peasants, this might be a cow, a small plot of land, or a chest of linens. For nobles, dowries were enormous, sometimes including castles, estates, or entire villages. For poor families, the burden of dowry could be crushing. Sometimes daughters were sent to convents simply because the family could not afford to marry them off. For nobles, dowries were investments, and noble girls were the bargaining chips. Fathers negotiated their daughters' futures like merchants haggling over goods at a market stall. And what of the girl herself? Her voice was almost never heard. A daughter's consent was theoretically required by church law, but in reality, few dared to refuse their parents' will. Disobedience risked not only disgrace, but abandonment.
Noble women as pawns of power. Nowhere was the political use of marriage clearer than in the lives of noble women. Their unions were not about affection, but about power. Kings and lords traded their daughters like chess pieces, forging alliances across kingdoms. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine. At just 15, she inherited vast lands, and her marriage was immediately arranged to the King of France, Louis VII. Later, her second marriage to Henry II of England united two powerful realms. Eleanor's story is extraordinary because she wielded influence and power. But behind her exceptional life lay the truth of countless noble girls. They were political tools, their bodies and futures bound to the ambitions of men. Betrothals could even serve as peace treaties. When two rival lords ended a feud, a daughter was often given in marriage to seal the truce. Her body became the bridge between enemies, her role to produce heirs who would unite bloodlines and secure the fragile peace. The reality of marriage. For peasant girls, marriage was often simpler but no less binding. A village girl might marry a farmer or a craftsman. Her role became that of housekeeper, field worker, and mother. Love might grow over time, but survival was always the priority. Husbands and wives were partners in labor, though the man still held authority by law and custom.
For noble girls, marriage often meant moving to a distant land, leaving behind family and childhood home. A 12-year-old bride might find herself in a foreign court, surrounded by strangers, expected to carry herself with grace, produce heirs, and secure her husband's dynasty. Her marriage was not the start of independence, it was the end of it. And for both noble and peasant wives, the dangers of childbirth loomed constantly. Marriage meant motherhood, and motherhood meant risk. Many girls died in their teens or 20s, victims of childbirth's dangers. Marriage was not just a union. It was often a death sentence. Marriage as a cage, and sometimes a weapon. Yet marriage was not always passive submission. Some women, especially noble women, learned to wield marriage as a weapon of their own. Queens and duchesses used their positions to influence politics, broker peace, or protect their husbands' claims to power. They worked within the cage, but they rattled its bars. But for most, marriage was a cage without escape. A girl who displeased her husband risked beatings, abandonment, or worse. Divorce was nearly impossible. Separation might be granted in rare cases, but the stigma was immense. Once married, a girl belonged to her husband in the eyes of the law, the church, and society. The emotional weight. Imagine being a girl of 12, knowing your marriage is already decided. You have little say in your own future. You may never see the man you were promised to until the wedding day. You may leave your family forever, stepping into a life of uncertainty. And once the vows are spoken, there is no turning back. It was a system that stripped girls of agency, transforming them into pawns on the board of life. And yet within this grim reality, girls still endured. Some found happiness, building lives with husbands who respected them. Others found ways to exert quiet influence, guiding decisions within the household. But many, too many, lived lives of silence and sacrifice, their names lost to history.
Exploitation, inequality, and lack of freedom. In the medieval world, being born a girl was not only a limitation, it was a vulnerability. From birth to death, a girl's life was circumscribed by rules, expectations, and restrictions designed to keep her in a place of submission. Inequality was not accidental. It was built into the very structure of medieval society. The law of men. The first layer of inequality was legal. A girl had no independent legal identity. She belonged first to her father, later to her husband. If she was widowed, she might briefly gain some independence, but even then, guardianship could pass to a male relative or son. The law saw women as dependents, incapable of managing their own affairs without male oversight. Property? Rarely hers. Rights? Limited. Inheritance? Almost always secondary to her brothers. A girl might bring a dowry into her marriage, but once given, it belonged not to her, but to her husband's household. If she was wronged, beaten, abandoned, or exploited, her chances of justice were slim. Courts often sided with men, reinforcing the hierarchy. Even crimes committed against women were filtered through the lens of property. An assault on a daughter was considered an offense against her father, an offense against a wife, an insult to her husband. Her own suffering mattered less than the dishonor done to the man who owned her. The vulnerability of the poor. For peasant girls, inequality often meant exploitation in labor. They worked as hard as men in the fields, hoeing, planting, and harvesting, yet their contribution was undervalued. If famine struck, food went first to fathers and brothers. Daughters ate last.
In villages, poor girls could also be vulnerable to the advances of wealthier men. A lord might coerce a servant girl, a craftsman's apprentice, or a tenant's daughter, and the girl had little recourse. To speak out was to risk shame, blame, and punishment, not for the man, but for herself. Honor and chastity were considered a woman's most valuable assets, and if they were taken from her, willingly or not, it was she who bore the lifelong stigma, the cage of morality. Religion reinforced these inequalities. The church taught that women were the daughters of Eve, burdened with her original sin. Priests preached that women were temptresses, their very bodies sources of danger and corruption. Girls grew up hearing warnings about modesty, obedience, and purity. To step outside these rules was to risk being branded a sinner, or worse, a witch. Purity was demanded, but hypocrisy thrived. Men could sin and repent. Women who sinned were often cast out, imprisoned, or executed. A girl who became pregnant outside of marriage, even if through coercion, faced social ruin. She might be abandoned by her family, forced into menial labor, or consigned to a convent in disgrace. Exploitation in marriage. Inequality did not end at the altar. For many girls, marriage itself became a site of exploitation. Husbands held legal and physical power over their wives. Beatings, though condemned by the church in theory, were often tolerated in practice. A wife who disobeyed could be corrected. A girl who resisted could be forced. Her boundaries of autonomy were nearly non-existent. Even her most sacred duty, bearing children, was not hers to control. Girls were expected to produce heirs year after year, often at the cost of their health and lives. To fail in childbirth was seen as failure of duty, not the tragedy it truly was. The weight of silence. Perhaps the most crushing inequality was silence. Medieval girls had little platform to speak, no means to record their stories. Chronicles were written by men. Laws were made by men. Sermons were preached by men. The voices of girls are almost entirely absent from the written record of the Middle Ages. And yet silence did not mean consent. It meant suppression.
Behind the walls of cottages, in whispered conversations between friends, in the private corners of convents, girls shared their fears, their hopes, their resistance. Their words may not have survived on parchment, but they lived in the air, in memory, in the endurance of their descendants.
Moments of resistance. Despite the crushing weight of inequality, some girls fought back, subtly, carefully. A servant girl might delay a chore to snatch a few moments of rest. A peasant daughter might hide a loaf of bread to feed herself when her brothers were given more. A noble woman might quietly influence her husband's decisions, planting ideas in his mind that she herself could never voice openly. These were small acts, invisible to chroniclers, but they were acts of survival. And in rare cases, resistance was louder. Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl, defied every expectation of her gender, claiming divine visions and leading armies in battle. For her defiance, she was celebrated, then burned at the stake, condemned by men who feared her power. Her story is extreme, but it illustrates the danger and possibility that came with breaking the mold. A life bound by others. Ultimately, exploitation and inequality were not simply occasional hardships for medieval girls. They were the very fabric of daily life. Every law, every sermon, every custom worked together to remind them of their place. Beneath men, beneath power, beneath freedom. And yet, they endured. They survived. And in their quiet endurance, they carried history forward. Without their labor, their children, their resilience, medieval society itself would not have endured. Daily life, peasant girls versus noble girls. The rhythms of daily life in the medieval world were shaped by class as much as by gender. A girl born into a peasant hut lived a life of relentless labor and hardship. A girl born into a noble hall lived in relative comfort, but still within the confines of expectation and duty. Both paths were vastly different, and yet, in their own ways, equally restrictive.
A day in the life of a peasant girl. The rooster's crow announced the start of the day, but a peasant girl was often awake before dawn. In the dim glow of the hearth, she might help her mother stir the embers back to life, blowing gently until sparks flared and smoke filled the air. Breakfast was simple. A chunk of coarse rye bread, perhaps dipped in ale or watered milk. Then the work began. She might carry water from the well, balancing the heavy bucket against her hip, or sweep the earthen floor with a rough broom. If she was old enough, she joined her family in the fields. Spring meant planting, barley, oats, and beans. Summer meant weeding and caring for animals. Autumn meant harvesting, often from sunrise to sunset. Winter brought its own labors, mending tools, spinning wool, preserving what little food they had managed to store. Meals were meager. Pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, was the staple. Meat was rare, often only eaten on feast days or stolen from the woods as illegal game. Malnutrition was constant, and hunger gnawed through every season. Clothing was plain and practical. A peasant girl wore a simple woolen tunic, rough against her skin, often patched and passed down from older siblings. She might go barefoot in summer, her feet hardened from the fields, and wear crude wooden clogs in the muddy winters. But there were moments of respite. On Sundays, she attended church, where the bells called the whole village together. Feast days brought music, dancing, and games in the village square. Children played with wooden toys, balls made of leather scraps, or simple games of tag. For a few brief moments, life lightened, and joy slipped in through the cracks of hardship. Yet the weight of expectation never disappeared. Even in childhood, a peasant girl's life was a cycle of labor, obedience, and survival. A day in the life of a noble girl. Now step into the halls of a noble manor or castle. Here, the air smells not of smoke and sweat, but of rushes strewn on stone floors, mixed with herbs meant to mask the odor of damp stone. The noble girl wakes in a bed draped with furs or wool blankets, attended by a servant who helps her dress.
Her clothing marks her status immediately. A linen shift, a gown of dyed wool, perhaps even embroidered with threads of silk or silver if her family is wealthy enough. Her shoes are soft leather, her hair brushed and braided carefully. Every detail of her appearance reflects the prestige of her family. Her meals are richer than those of peasants. Bread made from fine wheat, roasted meats, cheeses, and fruits when in season. Spices like cinnamon or pepper, imported at great cost, might flavor her food, showcasing her family's wealth. Ale and wine flowed freely, though watered down for children. Her duties are not in the fields, but in refinement. She practices embroidery, weaving delicate patterns with colored threads. She learns household management by observing her mother, how to oversee servants, manage accounts, and organize feasts. If she is fortunate, she may be taught to read, usually religious texts or prayers. Music and dance were also part of her training, preparing her to shine in courtly settings. But her life, though more comfortable, is no less controlled. She must always behave with grace, humility, and piety. Every action reflects upon her family's honor. Unlike a peasant girl, whose labor was physical, a noble girl's labor was social, maintaining appearances, reinforcing alliances, and preparing herself for the marriage that would one day serve her family's ambitions. Similarities in different worlds. Despite the vast gulf between peasant and noble life, some things were shared. Both girls were bound by obedience. Both had little control over their futures. Both were expected to marry, bear children, and uphold the honor of their families. Religion shaped their days equally. A peasant girl prayed in the village church, a noble girl in the family chapel. Both heard sermons that reinforced their duty to be modest, chaste, and obedient. Both carried the burden of being seen as morally weaker than men. And both, regardless of wealth, lived with the ever-present dangers of disease, hunger, and childbirth. A noble girl might have better food and warmer clothing, but she was not safe from plague or fever. Death respected no rank.
The contrast of dreams. Imagine the dreams of these two girls. The peasant girl might dream of a harvest strong enough to fill her family's bellies, or of a husband who would not beat her. The noble girl might dream of marrying a kind man rather than a cruel one, or of living close to her family instead of being sent across the kingdom. Different in detail, yet the same in spirit, both dreamed of lives they could not control. The reality of daily life. Whether in a smoky hut or a stone castle, the life of a medieval girl was not her own. From dawn to dusk, her day was mapped out by duty, her value measured by what she could contribute to her family and community. The peasant girl's hands were calloused from labor, the noble girl's fingers pricked from embroidery needles. Both bore the marks of their place in society. Both lived lives of service. And both, in their own ways, carried the silent strength that would allow them to endure the world that had been chosen for them.
Health struggles, dangers of childbirth, and limited medical care. If there was one constant shadow hanging over the life of a medieval girl, it was the threat of sickness. Health was fragile, medicine was primitive, and death could come at any age. From infancy to adulthood, every stage of life carried dangers that few could escape. Childhood survival. Even before a girl could walk, survival was uncertain. Nearly half of all children in the medieval world died before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, and poor sanitation claimed countless lives. A simple fever, which today could be treated in hours, might prove fatal. Diarrhea, infections, or contaminated water often killed infants before their first birthday. A peasant girl faced greater risks than a noble one, as hunger and exposure were constant companions. But noble girls were not invincible. Outbreaks of plague or influenza swept through castles just as swiftly as through cottages. Illness respected no walls, no wealth. Everyday ailments also took their toll. For peasant girls, malnutrition was nearly universal. Bread and pottage filled their bellies, but lacked the vitamins and proteins needed for long-term health. Rickets, scurvy, and other deficiencies often left them stunted or weak. Injuries from farm work, untreated infections from small cuts, and tooth decay were common. Noble girls suffered too, though in different ways. Their diets were richer, but sometimes imbalanced, too much meat, too little fiber, leading to digestive problems. They were also less active, which could bring its own frailties. And when epidemics struck, nobles often died in greater numbers, as entire households lived in close quarters behind stone walls where disease spread quickly.
The deadly specter of plague. Few events struck fear into the hearts of medieval girls like the plague. The Black Death of the mid-14th century decimated Europe, wiping out a third to half of the population. Villages vanished, families were torn apart, and survivors lived with the trauma of mass death. A girl who survived such a catastrophe carried scars, not just physical, but emotional. She might have lost parents, siblings, friends, and been left to face the world alone. The burden of childbirth. For girls who survived childhood, the greatest danger often came in adulthood, childbirth. From the moment a girl reached puberty, her body was expected to serve the role of motherhood. But with no knowledge of sanitation, no anesthesia, and almost no medical understanding, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Many girls were married in their teens, their bodies not yet fully developed. They carried pregnancies at great risk, their small frames often unable to bear the strain. Difficult labors were common, and tools to assist, like crude forceps or knives, often caused more harm than good. Infection after childbirth, known as childbed fever, killed countless mothers within days of delivery. And the newborns themselves faced grim odds. Without clean environments or proper care, infant mortality remained staggeringly high. A mother might bear 10 children, but see only half of them live to adulthood. Midwives and folk healers. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was limited, but not non-existent. Midwives played a crucial role in childbirth, using herbs, prayers, and experience to aid delivery. Some carried a reputation as wise women, blending folk remedies with religious rituals. Herbal medicine was the backbone of medieval care. A tea of chamomile might be used to ease pain, garlic to fight infection, willow bark to reduce fevers. Yet while some remedies worked, many others were ineffective or even dangerous. Doctors, trained in universities, were rare and expensive. And even then, their knowledge was based more on ancient theories of humors than real science. A noble family might summon a physician, but a peasant girl relied on local healers or her mother's passed down wisdom.
Religion and healing. The church also shaped medicine. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or a test of faith. Pilgrimages to holy shrines, prayers to saints, and blessings from priests were common treatments. Some families believed relics could cure disease, laying hands on bones of saints or drinking from sacred wells. For many girls, the line between medicine and religion blurred completely. They grew up believing their health depended as much on faith as on herbs. The weight of pain. It is easy to forget, in the modern world of hospitals and antibiotics, just how constant pain was in the medieval era. A toothache, untreated, could last for years. An infected wound could spread fever through the body. A broken bone might never heal properly, leaving a lifelong limp. For a medieval girl, health was not just fragile, it was precarious. She carried the awareness, even in youth, that death was never far away. Resilience amid fragility. And yet, medieval girls did not give up. They learned to endure, to carry on in the face of constant danger. Some became midwives themselves, passing on knowledge to the next generation. Others prayed fiercely, believing faith itself gave them strength. In their survival, they showed resilience that is easy to underestimate today. Every girl who grew into adulthood, who bore children, who lived to old age, rare though it was a testament to perseverance against the odds. Religious expectations and restrictions. To understand a medieval girl's life, you must step into a world dominated by faith. Religion was not simply a belief system, it was the framework through which society understood existence. From the moment a girl was born, the church's influence shaped her duties, her opportunities, and even her sense of self. Baptism and beginnings. A girl's first connection to religion came at baptism. Within days of birth, she was taken to the village church, sprinkled with holy water, and marked as a child of God. This was more than ritual, it was survival. The church taught that without baptism, a child's soul could not enter heaven. With infant mortality so high, parents rushed to baptize, fearing their little one might die unshriven. From that moment on, her life was threaded through with religious expectation. Daily devotion. Prayer was the rhythm of medieval life. Bells tolled from the church tower, marking the hours of the day with sacred time. A peasant girl paused her work to cross herself and whisper a prayer. A noble girl, kneeling in her family's chapel, recited psalms or memorized the Lord's Prayer. Every meal began with a blessing. Every journey was started with a prayer for protection. Every illness was met with appeals to saints. Religion was constant, woven into both public and private life. The burden of Eve. But religion was not only comfort, it was also a chain. Medieval theology cast women as daughters of Eve, the first to sin, the one who tempted Adam and brought humanity's fall. From this interpretation, priests preached that women were inherently weaker, more prone to temptation, and in need of male guidance. For a girl, this meant a lifelong message. You are less strong, less wise, less capable of resisting sin. Every sermon, every confession reminded her of her duty to remain pure, obedient, and submissive. Chastity and marriage. The church emphasized a girl's chastity as the foundation of her worth. A pure maiden brought honor to her family, while any hint of sexual activity outside marriage brought shame, regardless of consent. Virginity was prized, but marriage was expected.
Once wed, a girl's duties shifted. Her body now served her husband and the production of children. To deny her husband intimacy was considered a sin. Her religious duty was obedience in the home as much as in the church.
The convent as an escape. For some girls, the church offered another path, the convent. Noble families often sent daughters to monasteries, either because they could not afford a dowry or because they sought spiritual prestige. Life in a convent was strict, but it could provide education, stability, and even leadership opportunities unavailable elsewhere. A nun might learn to read and write Latin, to illuminate manuscripts, or to manage convent lands. Abbesses, who led convents, wielded considerable authority, overseeing estates and guiding the spiritual lives of their communities. But convent life was not always voluntary. Many girls were given to the church at a young age, growing up behind cloistered walls with little choice in the matter. For some, it was a prison. For others, it was a rare sanctuary from the dangers of marriage and childbirth. Punishment and fear. Religion also brought fear. Girls were taught to dread hellfire and eternal damnation. Sin was everywhere, in impure thoughts, in idle chatter, in disobedience. Confession and penance became essential rituals, a way to cleanse the soul and avoid damnation. Superstitions thrived alongside doctrine. Girls were warned of demons, witches, and the dangers of the devil's temptations. Storms, sickness, and stillbirths were often blamed on spiritual failings, with women, especially poor, outspoken ones, scapegoated as witches or sinners. Festivals and joy. Yet religion was not only restriction, it also brought community and celebration. Feast days filled the year with color and festivity. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days were occasions of music, dancing, plays, and processions. Even the poorest girl found joy in these moments, when work paused and the village came alive with laughter and song.
And these festivals, religion was less about fear and more about belonging. It reminded a girl that she was part of something larger, a community bound together by faith. Faith as strength. And for many girls, religion was not only a burden, but a source of resilience. Belief in God, the Virgin Mary, and the saints gave comfort in times of suffering. A peasant girl might pray to St. Anne for safe childbirth, or to St. Catherine for wisdom. A noble girl might seek solace in the Virgin Mary, seeing in her an image of female strength and purity. Faith gave meaning to suffering, framing it as part of God's plan. In a world full of hardship, this belief helped countless girls endure what might otherwise have felt unbearable. The dual edge of faith. Religion in the medieval world was a double-edged sword. It offered belonging, comfort, and purpose, but it also reinforced inequality, demanding obedience and submission from girls at every stage of life. For a medieval girl, faith was not a choice. It was the water she swam in, the air she breathed. It shaped her from cradle to grave, and even beyond, into the hope of salvation or the fear of eternal punishment.
Glimpses of power. Queens, noblewomen, and influential figures. Though most medieval girls lived lives defined by duty and silence, history does preserve rare glimpses of women who rose above these limitations. Queens, noblewomen, and saints sometimes stepped into roles of extraordinary power, leaving marks on history that still echo today. For ordinary girls, these figures served as distant symbols of what female strength could look like in a man's world. Queens, power behind the crown. Marriage was the usual route by which a woman entered the halls of power. Queens were expected to be consorts, mothers of heirs, keepers of courtly grace, and symbols of unity. But some queens became far more than ornamental. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Married first to the King of France and later to the King of England, she wielded influence over two of Europe's most powerful thrones. Eleanor led armies during the Crusades, governed vast territories in her own right, and even defied her husband, King Henry II, when their alliance collapsed. Few queens matched her reach, but her life showed that women could command both political and military authority. Or consider Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France. Married to Edward II of England, she eventually turned against him, joining forces with rebels, deposing him, and ruling as regent for her young son, the future Edward III. Her story revealed both the ruthlessness and the resilience possible for queens trapped in dangerous marriages. These women were exceptions, but they proved that power was not entirely closed to women if they were bold enough to seize it. Noblewomen.
guardians of estates. Even outside the crown, noble women often held quiet authority. When husbands or fathers went to war, women managed estates, collected rents, and defended castles. A noble girl raised in such households learned early that one day she might have to oversee hundreds of workers and soldiers. Matilda of Tuscany in the 11th century was one such figure. A powerful landholder in Italy, she commanded armies, built alliances with popes, and stood firm in the face of emperors. Though unusual, her leadership carved a model of female rule within the feudal system. Other noble women exercised power more subtly. Through diplomacy, patronage of artists or monasteries, and influence in family marriages, they shaped politics behind the scenes. Their voices might not appear in chronicles as boldly as kings, but their fingerprints were all over the decisions of their families and realms.
The power of saints and mystics. Not all influential medieval women held secular titles. Some wielded spiritual authority. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, combined visions, music, science, and theology into writings that were revered across Europe. Her voice carried into courts and papal chambers, earning her recognition as a prophetess in her own time. Others, like Saint Clare of Assisi, founded religious movements, shaping spirituality for generations. Girls in convents could look to these figures as proof that devotion could transform into influence. Mystics, visionaries, and saints often commanded more reverence than noble titles precisely because their power was believed to come from God rather than inheritance. In a society that distrusted female voices, divine inspiration could elevate them above suspicion. Joan of Arc, the girl who became a legend. Among all medieval figures, few shine as brightly as Joan of Arc. Born a peasant girl in France, she claimed to hear the voices of saints guiding her to save her country. At only 17, she convinced nobles and kings to give her command of armies. Against all odds, she led French forces to victories that shifted the course of the 100 Years' War. But her triumph came at a cost. Captured by enemies, she was handed over to the English and put on trial. Accused of heresy, witchcraft, and dressing as a man, she was burned at the stake at just 19 years old. Joan's death was meant to silence her, yet her legacy only grew. For girls of her time and for centuries after, she symbolized courage, conviction, and the possibility of breaking through the limits imposed by society. Rare, but revealing. It must be remembered, these examples were rare. Most girls would never come close to such power. The majority lived and died in obscurity, their stories unrecorded. But the existence of queens, saints, and visionaries revealed something crucial, that even in the most restrictive times, women found ways to shape history. Their lives were not models for all, but they showed that the system was not absolute. Where opportunity appeared, through marriage, inheritance, faith, or sheer defiance, women could rise. What they meant for ordinary girls. For peasant and noble girls alike, hearing tales of Eleanor of Aquitaine or Joan of Arc was more than entertainment. It was inspiration. Stories of powerful women circulated in songs, legends, and whispers, carrying the idea, however faint, that a girl was not entirely powerless. Perhaps a peasant girl spinning wool by the hearth dreamed of Joan, the shepherd's daughter who led armies. Perhaps a noble girl, preparing for her arranged marriage, thought of Eleanor, who had once dared to rebel against her king. These stories mattered because they broke the silence, if only briefly, and showed a different path. The glimmers in the darkness. The lives of medieval girls were mostly constrained by obedience, hardship, and inequality. But history's pages remind us that within the darkness there were sparks, women who, by will, wit, or faith, carved out legacies of power. These glimpses do not erase the suffering of the many, but they do prove that the potential for female strength was always present, waiting for cracks in the walls of patriarchy to let it through. Survival strategies, resilience, and coping with oppression. If the medieval world was a cage, then survival was an art. Girls, whether born in smoky cottages or within castle walls, learned strategies to endure, adapt, and carry on in a world that offered them so little freedom.
endurance in the everyday. The first form of resilience was simply persistence. A peasant girl who hauled water, gathered firewood, and labored in the fields did so with little rest, yet she endured. Her survival was not glamorous, but it was essential. By keeping families alive, by raising children, by doing the unnoticed work of daily life, she became the backbone of her community. Strength in silence. In many cases, resistance was quiet, subtle. A girl might hide food for herself when her brothers were given more. She might whisper forbidden stories with her friends. She might pray in ways that gave her strength beyond the sermons that condemned her. These small rebellions were often invisible, yet they carried a power all their own. Networks of women. Another form of resilience was community. Girls and women leaned on each other, sharing wisdom and labor. Midwives passed down knowledge of childbirth. Mothers taught daughters the skills needed to keep a family alive. Even gossip at the village well or sewing circle could become a lifeline, a moment of connection in lives otherwise filled with duty. For noble girls, female networks were also critical. Letters between sisters, alliances with mothers or aunts, or companionship with ladies-in-waiting provided comfort and subtle influence in courts dominated by men.
Faith as armor. Religion, though restrictive, could also be a source of resilience. Many girls found comfort in devotion to the Virgin Mary, who offered a model of holiness and maternal strength. Saints became intercessors, protectors, and role models. Faith gave suffering meaning, allowing girls to believe that their endurance was part of a divine plan. For some, convent life became both an escape and a strategy. Within cloistered walls, a girl might gain education, authority, and a form of independence not found in marriage. Though not free, she could carve out a spiritual space of influence. Dreams of something more. Even in their oppression, girls dreamed. A peasant girl might imagine a harvest so abundant her family never knew hunger again. A noble girl might dream of love rather than duty, of kindness rather than cruelty. These dreams did not erase hardship, but they kept hope alive, a kind of survival that began in the imagination. The legacy of survival. Perhaps the greatest testament to resilience is that despite inequality, exploitation, and constant danger, medieval girls endured long enough to carry life forward. They gave birth, raised children, kept homes, and sustained societies. Without them, there would be no history to tell. Their names may not be written in chronicles. Their words may not survive on parchment. But their survival was its own form of defiance, a refusal to let hardship erase them. The final reflection.
So what do we see looking back on the life of a medieval girl? We see a world of restriction, where law, religion, and custom conspired to keep her in obedience. We see a world of danger, where disease, hunger, and childbirth claimed countless lives. We see a world of silence, where her voice was rarely recorded, her story rarely told. But we also see endurance. We see quiet strength. We see flashes of power, queens who defied kings, saints who shaped faith, and ordinary girls who carried humanity through centuries of hardship. To imagine being a girl in the medieval era is to imagine a life of struggle, but also one of remarkable resilience. It is to imagine surviving against the odds, not by choice, but by necessity. And it leaves us with a question: how many of us, today, could endure what they did? If this journey through the life of a medieval girl has gripped you, if you felt the weight of her struggles, the chill of her dangers, and the spark of her resilience, then don't let her story vanish into silence once more. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss stories like this. Like this video if you learned something new. Drop a comment, tell us which part of a medieval girl's life shocked you the most. And share this video so more people can understand the hidden realities of history. Because when we remember the lives of those forgotten by history, we give them back a voice. And in doing so, we carry their endurance forward into our own time.